Hello again, Zoning for Equity students. My name is Pavel Munkanen from UCLA, recording a presentation for you on affirmatively furthering fair housing, which, as we've learned in previous lectures, was part of the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. I think the Kerner Commission report, which was published a few months before that, is an extremely important document for understanding and reflecting on the role of federal government, what people knew when, and what actions they took or did not take about those knowledge. The Kerner Commission report was commissioned after the upheaval and uprisings across cities in the United States in 1967 in the summer. And the report, I think, really nailed the causes and problems of cities in the US at that time, the problem of housing segregation, and the fact of white society being deeply implicated in the ghetto, having created it, maintaining it, and condoning it, right? I think that the focus on opportunity hoarding today and areas of exclusion and affluence as the problem, rather than trying to pathologize lower income neighborhoods or Black neighborhoods or disinvested neighborhoods, I think is kind of explicit in the Kerner Commission report, but really still not part of the kind of public understanding of issues in US cities, and it definitely wasn't in the 70s. So it's an important document. I recommend checking it out, if not just for the historical interest. But today I'm going to be talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing today, and how it can help us guide our thoughts on zoning for equity, and potentially be an important lever in the fight against exclusionary zoning. I'll do a brief history of the lack of action on the AFFH law until 2015. Basically, there were some very weak attempts from HUD to push local jurisdictions to analyze impediments to fair housing and do something about them. In the last year of the Obama administration, HUD released a rule called the 2015 AFFH rule that provided a more stringent framework that needed to be used by jurisdictions in doing analyses of fair housing. So it was a big deal and an improvement, still so little in the face of the magnitude of the problem, as I'll illustrate with some data from California. I'll talk one slide about the role of federal government in land use planning. That's something that's come up already in previous lectures, especially Rolf's discussion of week 3. I'll talk about the expanded meaning of AFFH and kind of how, although the Kerner Commission report really, I think, identified the problems that still exist, I think that there have been many changes since 1968 in US cities, and really the thinking around reversing the legacy of segregation is still an important component of affirmatively furthering fair housing. But the expansion of what AFFH means to also include what, in the language of AFFH, I mean, these terms are definitely should be debated and probably changed, but this idea of transforming racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, I prefer kind of investing in disinvested neighborhoods as kind of an important other half of an AFFH framework. I'll talk also a little bit about California. I think California is quite interesting in our current AFFH fights, and I have created a metric, an AFFH Site Score for the housing elements sites inventories that I discussed in my last lecture, that I think both illustrates the magnitude of the problem, which is large, as well as a fundamental challenge we have facing us, and something that I hope students can work on in their careers, which is a disconnect between the way we build subsidized housing in the United States and the kinds of parcels that are available in high opportunity neighborhoods in the United States. So that will make sense by slide 20. Okay, so AFFH is the never fully implemented half of the Fair Housing Act, right? So the other part of the Fair Housing Act that did get more implementation effort was around anti-discrimination and fair housing in terms of preventing discrimination in access to housing. This half, the AFFH half, sought to undo the legacy of segregation that the federal government had helped create. As I mentioned, the world has changed since 1968, and so kind of the meaning of what AFFH should be, I think, should be reopened and discussed, and especially around kind of investing in disinvested neighborhoods, efforts to do anti-displacement policies, et cetera. I think it's, a useful framework for this class, actually, because you think about zoning for equity, it would be around something like the model of affirmatively furthering fair housing, especially the expanded version of it, along with reparations. And combine these three things could be actual remedies for the urban history of the US. Some of the stuff I'm talking about in this lecture comes from MIT's Furthering Fair Housing website. Justin Steele and Nick Kelly have a book and a couple of articles that are quite good on this topic that I recommend checking out. They even have links to analyses of fair housing if you'd like to see some in the wild. So as I mentioned, until 2015, HUD didn't do much in terms of forcing local jurisdictions to analyze their impediments to fair housing and do something about them. They issued some orders in the 1980s, asking nicely cities to do this, suggesting some possible ways they could do it. The Fair Housing Planning Guide in 1996 gave a bit more guidance and was a bit better. But basically, the vague nature of the rule, this meta regulation that told cities how to regulate land within their boundaries and programs around housing was pretty weak. Partly because of the implementation framework of it, but partly because their stick, if you will, kind of their threat to local jurisdictions wasn't that large for most local jurisdictions. Basically, federal grantees, so all local governments and public housing authorities getting funds from the federal government have to submit a consolidated plan. Well, not all, larger ones, most, or they have to be part of a consolidated plan if they're small cities in order to get CDBG funding. So, the threat of not getting CDBG funding and other federal programs, access to other federal housing programs through HUD, is larger for some cities than it is for others, and larger at different points in time than it is for others. So some COVID money can be coming through these channels, so that might be more important to cities. But the main problem until 2015 is that the guidelines were very vague. As a result, the analyses were very vague. Things like we will endeavor to make housing more, housing available that's affordable to low-income households, but without timelines, without metrics, without benchmarks, how many housing units, by when, things like that. And HUD rarely even reviewed the analyses of impediments. There were no consequences for filing one. Some kind of audit studies found that, I think more than a third of jurisdictions never even submitted one, even the ones that were supposed to, and the ones that did submit were mostly bad. In 2015, like I said, a new rule came out around affirmatively furthering fair housing, requiring assessments of fair housing, AFHs. And the AFH improved upon the analysis of impediments in several ways. HUD provided a tool with data and specific asks to local jurisdictions in terms of maps they needed to produce, calculations they needed to do, dissimilarity indexes of segregation, access to homeownership by race, complaints, fair housing complaints by jurisdiction, kind of specific sets of analyses. They also required community participation. So, using these analyses, they had to engage their constituents in a conversation about the causes of unequal outcomes, what factors are contributing to these unequal outcomes, and then set some goals to remedy the unequal outcomes with metrics, with milestones, and with kind of action items and who was going to do what. Then they have to submit annual plans talking about when their progress along these goals. So if you think about the plan mandate framework that I discussed in the last lecture, right, this is quite similar in terms of kind of superintending local action, forcing local governments to do something. If you let them get away with vague analyses, they definitely will. So this nice paper by Justin Steele and Nick Kelly compares analyses of impediments to assessments of fair housing for the same jurisdiction. So they find a bunch of, I think, 20-something jurisdictions that submitted in an AI in the 1990s, and then later in 2016 submitted an AFH, and they compare kind of directly, and they see that, yes, indeed, the new rule had a big impact on the documents that these cities were producing, and the actions they were taking as a result of having to produce these documents. So that was great. That worked. You know, in terms of the big picture, as I'll mention, I think the magnitude of the problem is such that the actions, even in the best cases that cities are taking based on these assessments of fair housing, are far from sufficient to change things substantially. Not only that, in terms of like a federal policy and thinking about the United States as a country, during the 2 years that the 2015 rule was very active and being followed before the Trump White House suspended it, only 49 assessments of fair housing were filed. And some of those are representing more than one jurisdiction. So urban counties, so for cities smaller than 50,000 people, they're not directly HUD grantees. They receive, they're called participating entities or something, and they receive their CDBG money, for example, through the county that they're in. So for those smaller cities, though, then that means they don't have to do an AFH, and their kind of situation is considered within the AFH of the county. And so I'll use LA County for an example, and LA County has 47 small cities that it considers as part of its assessment of fair housing. Many of those, the exclusionary cities of LA County, so Beverly Hills and Culver City and places like that, right? So that is I think a problem because it's not really asking Beverly Hills to do this analysis. The county is doing it on their behalf. And so I think the impact is much smaller because of that. Not only that, this pace, right? So if we think about 20,000 municipalities in the country and 100 of them every 2 years, right? It's going to take a long time to get through all of them or get through even the ones that are the exclusionary ones. So LA County, I think, is a good example. You know, you can look at, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. You can see the 469 pages of maps and analyses and everything that goes into it. This is the table of contents, right? They talk a lot about how they did the community participation process and what came out of that. They assess past goals for 10 pages, and then they spend kind of 400 pages on maps, summary of data, et cetera. And so, like I said, there's these 47 cities that are covered in this analysis. And here's just some examples of the kinds of analyses that they're doing with the HUD tool, right? They do a bunch of different maps of just kind of racial ethnic concentration across the landscape, and then overlay that with, you know, homeownership trends and access to different parts of the city, trends in segregation, not looking good, stable or increasing, declining very slightly in some cases, opportunity indicators, you know, fair housing complaints, a whole multitude of different analyses. I encourage, you know, it would be interesting to do a separate project where we look at what the proposals are actually in terms of fair housing goals in these AFHs. So if you want to learn more, Nick and Justin's papers do that a little bit. You know, they're a little less critical than I would be. I think a lot of the fair housing goals that I saw in the LA County AFH are pretty, you know, they're important goals. Enhancing accessible housing and supportive services to people with disabilities, absolutely an important goal. If you're thinking about reversing the legacy of segregation in LA County, that's not maybe the main thing I would do, and it's not kind of at the scale that you would need to take action. So I think, you know, they're a little disappointing in terms of the goals they set out, but others are better. And, you know, so for example, Temecula, California, which is a jurisdiction that Justin and Nick highlight in their work, because their AFH was so much better than their AI, does have kind of specific goals around housing. You know, we're going to spend $12 million to build 100 units starting in 2017, completed by 2020. So this is the kind of planning goals with numbers that we like to see, because it makes it much more credible that they're actually going to do it. Okay, so this is something that Rolf touched on, and also the interview with Sadian that works for the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And, you know, it's thinking about how much action we can conceivably expect from the federal government on exclusionary zoning. You know, I think the Obama White House was great, and they put out this toolkit on exclusionary zoning in their last year as well. And we're expecting much bigger things from the Biden administration, but ultimately, because the federal government has basically relinquished land use authority to state governments, and states have relinquished it to city governments, right, it's going to be limited. From the feds, the money is going to be the main thing, I think, going forward, which matters. And also, I think this speech by Alex Fish, the mayor of Culver City, that I shared with the link, I shared a link to you for. He talks about the importance of the symbolism and the importance of discourse around this at the federal level for local action, right? So it made me think about this famous quote about there's not a Republican or Democratic way to take out the trash. And currently there's not a Republican or Democratic way to zone your city, right? Which is a big problem because, I think in theory, democratic values shouldn't continue to uphold exclusionary zoning. And the party through the federal government and through, the party leaders at the federal level could create a democratic way to zone your city that doesn't uphold exclusionary zoning. And that would, I think, be a powerful tool to push local governments to change. I'm not going to get into qualified action plans, but if you're interested in, I just put this up there because the federal government does build subsidized housing through the low-income housing tax credit program, which is managed by the IRS, not HUD. And even for that, the spatial aspects of low-income housing tax credit projects are managed at the state level through qualified action plans, and they don't do a very good job. Most low-income housing tax credit projects don't get built in high opportunity neighborhoods, unfortunately. So it's another thing that this class, were it much longer, could also look into that aspect. Okay, I did want to bring up this expanded definition of AFFH again, right? Because with the original idea in 1968 being along the lines of opening up the suburbs as the solution, right? So this mobility mindset of moving to opportunity was really in the air in those days. And nowadays, that's very much reconsidered. Now there's a very much a focus on disinvested places and how to help them, how to work against displacement rather than seeing the solution as mobility. So I think that has, that cultural understanding of the problem and the solution to it has changed a lot. And as such, AFFH in its California implementation especially has included this aspect in the set of actions that local governments are expected to take. I would love to know more about the intellectual history of how this change happened. I didn't find, tracing it through the different iterations of guidelines from HUD, et cetera. I haven't been able to do that, but maybe that's something we can get to later in the quarter. For now, I will just end with the discussion of California and my metric of the AFFH Site Score that I think reveals some interesting facts about affirmatively furthering fair housing and the challenges we face. So we've adopted in California as state law that local governments need to AFFH. Especially, they need to do this in the update of the housing element of their general plan, which you learned a lot about in my last lecture. The guidelines for this update of the housing element of their general plan includes both the kind of traditional opening up access to opportunity and fostering inclusive communities by letting people into exclusionary communities, previously exclusionary communities, but also this important bullet point about, in their words, transforming racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of our opportunity, right? So this term also, I need to mention the term recap, racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, I dislike, and you can talk with your instructors about their thoughts on that concept as problematic. So total mess of an implementation in California around its AFFH law. It's a really disappointing story of kind of bureaucratic failure in my mind. I'm not sure why it happened this way, but basically the law passed in 2017 and it said every city updating their housing element after January 1st, 2021 would need to AFFH, but the specific guidelines of what that meant were not issued until April 2021. Even though they had 2 years to do it, they issued them after this was supposed to be in effect. And then for cities like San Diego that was submitting their housing element in June, right? So they were supposed to do this, but the guidelines were not given to them, until 2 months before. It's like your professor giving you the the definition of the outline of the term paper two days before it's due or something, right? And so they had a plausible excuse to say, oh, we're not doing anything because you didn't tell us. So that's a real disappointment in terms of how it's playing out here. The guidelines are decent though, so that's good. They're too vague for my taste. We were trying to push them through letters and internal advocacy to be more specific in their expectations around AFFH so that cities couldn't use the vagueness of the guidelines to not do anything. So many cities are ignoring them. We'll see kind of what happens on the enforcement side of things. In some cases, local advocates are able to use this new law and these guidelines to really push for change. City of LA, I mentioned, is a good example if you want to look at a housing element. Also, the city of Alhambra has some good stuff in there. Okay, so you're not in California, probably. Why should you care? I think what's happening in California both illustrates the challenge, a clear way to assess exclusion through the AFFH Site Score in land use plans, and this lack of clarity, but at the same time kind of openness for innovation in how to do the other half of AFFH that helping disinvested places have. So this AFFH Site Score I mentioned, I'll just walk through really quickly. Basically, here's a map, 2 maps of Santa Monica with hypothetical affordable housing plans, right? So these are the census block groups in Santa Monica. The darker blue ones are the richer ones. And we see 2 ways that they could allocate their assigned affordable housing, right? So these are parcels eligible for low-income housing construction. We could see that Plan A, they put most of it in the low-income part of the city, and Plan B, they put most of it in the high-income part of the city. Now, it would be nice if you could quantify the difference between these 2 plans in order to compare cities and how they're doing on this front. And so we developed a way to do that called the AFFH Site Score. Basically, these graphs show the same information as those maps, right? So divide the city into these 3 different areas based on income levels of the neighborhoods, and then look at what % of the low-income housing units sites, right, in the plan, like this is where we want to build affordable housing in our city. Do we want to build it predominantly in low-income neighborhoods, as with Plan A, or do we want to build it predominantly in high-income neighborhoods with Plan B, right? And if we think about reversing the legacy of segregation, we have to have something like Plan B, right? If we continue to put parcels where low-income housing can be built in the lowest income neighborhoods, that's definitely not going to reverse the legacy of segregation because we're leaving the rich neighborhoods untouched. So we developed this score that ranges from -1 to 1, where -1 is all of your low-income housing sites are located in the poorest block group, and 1 is all of your low-income housing sites are located in the richest block group. So if it's negative, it means you're disproportionately locating sites in lower income parts of the city. If it's positive, you're disproportionately locating low-income sites in the wealthier part of the city. So Plan A is a -0.6 and Plan B is a 0.5. I don't know if I have the actual numbers, but Santa Monica, these are hypothetical plans. Santa Monica's actual plan is much more like Plan A. Its score is -0.4. If you want to learn more about the math stuff, this is based on like a Gini index using cumulative land area and cumulative sites area ranking block groups by income. There's a presentation that's linked to here that explains it in greater detail. So I think it's a useful metric because we can compare cities, we can look at this like the state of play in terms of where cities are citing low-income housing. We're geocoding sites inventories from Southern California cities. The Association of Bay Area Governments already did that, thankfully, for Bay Area cities. So we have data from 70 jurisdictions, and we calculated these site scores for these 70 cities in the San Francisco Bay. The median city's AFFH score was -0.4. So the average city is doing something like Plan A. And like 2 cities are doing something like Plan B, right? 56 of the 70 have a negative score. And the cities with a positive score were mostly small cities. So several of them have like 5 or 10 block groups, right? So this is, if you think about it, we cite low-income housing, we allow it to be built, usually on corridors and near where multifamily housing already exists. So, think about the city you live in. If you want to calculate the site score for your city, that's something you could do. But you could, if you don't want to do the technical stuff, you could just think like where are the richest neighborhoods of the city you live in, and can multifamily housing be built? Okay, so the last thing I wanted to point out is this, I think, fundamental challenge between what I call the parcel and housing type mismatch in America, which is that most of our high opportunity neighborhoods look like the picture on the left, right? So we've created this zoning system that separates the city into quote unquote residential neighborhoods separate from the rest of the city. We've put all of our disamenities and problematic land uses that pollute into the rest of the city, and to quote unquote protect these single family neighborhoods. But most of our low income housing, affordable housing, looks like the picture on the right, which are buildings with 50 or more units usually, and requiring a parcel of half an acre or acre size. They often don't exist in these neighborhoods. So thinking about how do we connect the product type for affordable housing, right? So we either need to develop a 4 to 6 unit affordable housing product type, which would be great, or figure out how to get more units into parcels in single family neighborhoods, whether by allowing 3 to 4 story buildings or doing some kind of land assembly more aggressively, right? So I think these are where the kind of future innovative solutions need to be done. And that's about it. Just to recap, I think it's a monumental task. Obviously, this class is teaching us that to reverse the legacy of segregation and exclusionary zoning. Federal action, I think, is not going to be extremely aggressive on this front. I mentioned this kind of previous idea and the evolution beyond just putting affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods. That is still, I think, at least half the battle, right? But then there is this other half that has become more on people's radars, and I think the kind of experiments happening across California in terms of what cities set out as their goals around anti-displacement or investment and other kinds of actions to affirmatively further fair housing in places that aren't exclusionary. Like, what does that mean? I think is an interesting space for people to work on and progress to be made. So thanks for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions. As usual, look forward to seeing you later.